Okay, so we're going to get started with some economics questions. My name is Jeffrey. I'll be looking over some common micro macro questions that have been submitted before. We're going to go over the answers together, and then we'll go over and compare that to some of the answers that previous tutors have said to make sure that those are right. That being said, let's get started. So the first question says that GDP tends to overstate economic well-being because it takes into account 1. Improvements in product quality over time. 2. Social costs related to the consumption of products with adverse health effects. 3. Illegal activities of individuals and businesses. 4. Non-market activities such as the productive work of housemakers. So remember that when we talk about GDP, we're calculating that as the total value of all goods and services produced within a country in a given amount of time, basically a year. And so a common approach would be to use the expenditure approach, which would be consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And so we're looking to see which one of these answer choices falls into one of those 4 categories of spending and yet is actually not a good thing for overall well-being, economic well-being. So let's take a look. So 1 says improvements in product quality over time. And so this is probably indirectly captured in the GDP calculation through higher prices for certain goods or greater demand for certain goods. And so product quality is captured, and it's also not really something that's overstated, right? We think that product quality being better is something that is positive for economic well-being. And so while it is something that's captured by GDP, it's not something that overstates well-being. So 1 might not be the best answer. 2 says social costs related to the consumption of products with adverse health effects. And this might be the right answer, right? Because we understand that social costs are captured expenditure on certain medical services or expenditure on products like tobacco or alcohol, which might be bad for you. Those are all included within our analysis of the overall GDP through the expenditure approach. And so those are included factors in GDP, and they are detrimental to well-being, right? We don't believe that high consumption of tobacco products necessarily translates into economic well-being, and yet GDP captures that expenditure and portrays that expenditure as part of economic well-being. And so this seems to be a really good choice. But let's take a look at the other 2 answers just to be sure. The third answer choice says illegal activities of individuals and businesses. And right off the bat, off our first criteria of being included in GDP, we can eliminate this answer choice. We know that the GDP expenditure approach really only captures spending in the legal markets, right? We only have a way to measure spending that's happening in measurable legal markets. We can't really measure activity in illegal markets like the illegal drug market or black markets and stuff like that. There's no appropriate way to measure the size of those markets and very accurately, and so we don't include that in our analysis of GDP. And so GDP doesn't take into account illegal activities, and that's why we can eliminate 3. And finally 4, non-market activities such as productive work of homemakers. And again, this is something that right off the bat we can eliminate because it doesn't meet our first criteria, which is being measured by GDP. If activity takes place in the home and not in the market, we again don't have a really good measurement for the total value of the work that's being done outside the markets. And so GDP is not going to include any calculations that try to adjust for non-market activities, and that's why 4 won't be the right answer. So 2 seems to be the best answer for us here. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answers to make sure. The previous tutor says 2 as well, and they said that GDP is an imperfect measure of economic well-being as it is merely an aggregate of all value generated from commercialized production. It overstates and understates the standard of living in an economy in numerous ways. When it comes to its overestimation shortcoming, GDP includes the costs of all products sold that tend to adversely affect the health of a consumer, but fails to incorporate the loss of standard of living due to failing human health. So yeah, that is true. And so we're going to say good answer and mark that as correct. Okay, next question talks about game theory terminology. Let's see if I can extend this a little bit larger to give us some more room to see. It says select a term that best describes each definition listed in the following table. And so we have definitions on the left side, and in the columns we have different terms. So let's take a look at the terms real quick. So first we have Nash equilibrium, then dominant strategy, then it looks like collusion. Is there a scroll bar? Yep. Nash equilibrium, dominant strategy, collusion, tit for tat strategy, payoff matrix, and prisoner's dilemma game. I don't think there's any more. Yeah, okay. And then the 4 definitions we have listed here. So let's take a look at the first one. First one says a player's best choice if it exists, regardless of his or her opponent's strategy. So there's not much to explain here. Like, this is just stuff that you're gonna have to memorize and understand from a definitions point of view. So for this question, your strategy, regardless of what your opponent does, it doesn't change at all. That's going to be something that's called a dominant strategy. And it doesn't always exist, but when it does exist, it basically means you don't care what other people do, but you just do whatever you do, because no matter what, that's going to be your optimal strategy. So this is dominant strategy. Next definition says a set of strategies, one for each player, in which each player's strategy is the best option for that player, given the chosen strategy of the player's opponents. And so this is going to be basically an equilibrium point that you reach based on your assumptions for other players' choices. And it's going to be what we call Nash equilibrium, a set of strategies for both parties that results in equilibrium given each other's strategy. The third says a case in which individually rational behavior leads to a jointly inefficient outcome. And that's going to be what we think of when we are talking about prisoner's dilemma game, where for those of you who aren't very familiar with game theory yet, basically, I think this is best explained with a prisoner's dilemma matrix. Basically, you're in a situation in which 2 people are arrested for committing a crime, they're partners in crime, and then they're interrogated separately and they're given a choice, right? They're given a choice to either turn on their partner, and this is probably a little bit easier to understand. So they can either turn on their partner, or they can not confess to the crime and kind of stay silent. And so by confessing to a crime, they would be turning on their partner. And so we can see here that in a traditional prisoner's dilemma matrix, oops, this looks like I went back. Just 1 second to get back to the right page, right? So anyways, so for this matrix, we can see that if both players are going to confess, and they both try to turn on each other, but if they both come clean, they both get 6 years in jail. However, if one player confesses and the other player doesn't confess, like in this square or this square, then the player who confesses gets no time in jail, and the player who doesn't confess gets 10 years in jail, because he basically gets thrown under the bus. And finally, the best strategy is if they both choose to remain silent, they get 1 year in jail for pleading to a smaller crime. And so that is going to be the best opportunity for them. So if they could collude and if they could work together, they would say, let's both not confess, and we would get to this optimal outcome of only serving 1 year in jail each. And yet, because they can't collude and they can't communicate, what you see is that the optimal strategy for both is to confess, and they'll end up in this square over here where they both serve 6 years in jail. And so that outcome of this kind of payoff matrix game is what we call prisoner's dilemma. And so that is the answer for this third definition. And finally, our fourth definition, a visual representation of a game showing all possible strategies for each player and all potential outcomes and payoffs. That's what we see right here. And this is an example of what we would call a payoff matrix. And so that was one of the answer choices as well. So that's all 4 definitions, and we can take a look at what the previous tutors have said. First definition, they said the dominant strategy defines a player's best choice if it exists. Great. Second says Nash equilibrium. We agree. Third says the prisoner's dilemma. And fourth says payoff matrix. So it looks like we are all in agreement here. So you can mark that as correct. Next question says, what are the goals when a government uses expansionary monetary policy? Check all that apply. And one says increasing its money supply to boost the economy. 2 says decreasing its money supply to slow the economy. 3 says increasing its money supply to speed business expansion. 4 says decreasing its money supply to curb business expansion. And 5 says decreasing its interest rates to increase investment spending. So it's important to understand what expansionary policy means, right? And basically, you would engage in expansionary policy in a situation in which the economy is doing is producing at a level lower than the potential GDP. So you have long-run aggregate supply here, and this is potential GDP, and then you have short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply. So here you have this recessionary gap, right, where the economy is producing at this GDP level, and then that you would want it to be at this optimal Q star level, right? So it's too small. And so you want to stimulate the economy, basically shift aggregate demand to the right, so that, this is a little bit laggy, so that you would be able to have, all right, let's try drawing that again. Assume that's right here at this equilibrium point. And so you want to be able to shift the aggregate demand to the right to expand demand and get to this long-run aggregate supply curve where you would have this optimal GDP output. And so how do we go about doing that through monetary supply? And so the thing that the money supply is going to affect the most is going to be something like interest rate, right? And so a low interest rate is going to allow the economy to grow faster, because a low interest rate means more businesses take out loans to invest into the economy. People are less likely to put money into savings, more likely to consume. And so all these things are factors are going to stimulate consumption and investment spending, right? And so that growth is what we're looking to see. So what can the Fed do to decrease interest rates? So we know the money supply graph looks like this, right? I'm not sure why this is lagging all over the place. We have interest rates on the y-axis, and then we have the quantity of money on the x-axis. And so it looks something like this. And so right now we might be here. What can we do? This is money supply, and this is demand for money. Demand for money is going to stay the same. What can we do to lower interest rates? We're going to increase the money supply. If we increase the money supply, we have increased overall money in circulation, and we've also dropped the interest rate from where it used to be. It used to be up here, and now it's down here. And so that lower interest rate is going to be what we were trying to accomplish. So hopefully this explanation makes sense. There's a recessionary gap. The Fed looks at that and says, we want to stimulate the economy. How do we do that? We want to lower the interest rate. How do we do that? We want to increase the money supply. And so that's kind of the three-step process in which we would see. So let's see which one of these answer choices kind of fits within that process, right? So one says it wants to increase its money supply to boost the economy. And yeah, that's steps 1 and 3. You're increasing the money supply, and step 3 is boosting the economy by increasing aggregate demand. So 1 is going to be the correct answer here for sure. 2 says decreasing its money supply to slow the economy. Right off the bat, we know that money supply isn't decreasing, it's increasing, so we can eliminate this answer choice. 3 says increasing its money supply to speed business expansion. Again, the same concept as part 1. We know we would increase the money supply. We know eventually we want investment spending by businesses to go up, and so that's going to be a correct answer as well. 4 says decreasing its money supply to curb business expansion. Again, off the bat, eliminate the answer choice because we're increasing money supply, not decreasing. And finally, 5, decreasing interest rates to increase investment spending. And again, yes, we are. That's step 2, right? Step 2 is decreasing interest rates. Step 3, increased investment spending. So 5 is going to be the right answer as well. So between these 5 answer choices, we're left with 1, 3, and 5 as the best ones for our answer choice. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. Previous tutor says that the correct answers to this question are options 1, 3, and 5. Expansionary monetary policy is an arrangement of a central bank by which a central bank utilizes its devices to stimulate the economy. It increases the money supply, bringing down financing costs, and expands total demand. It supports growth and development as estimated by total national output. It brings down the value of the currency, thereby diminishing the swapping rate. The money supply is expanded, and the loan fees are diminished with the goal that the total demand is expanded and helps the organization in its development. It likewise helps in fighting joblessness. Likewise, the GDP expands, which is demonstrated as a positive indication of development. I don't think there's anything specifically wrong with this explanation. I just think it's a little bit less clear than it could be. Like, the thing we care about is expansionary monetary policy and what that means, right? Expansionary monetary policy means the Fed, the central bank, tries to manipulate the money supply in order to stimulate aggregate demand. Or to do that, they increase the money supply, which leads to a new equilibrium on the money market graph with a lower interest rate. Lower interest rates stimulate both consumption and investment spending, which shifts aggregate demand to the right. This helps to close the recessionary gap. Okay, so nothing wrong with the solution. I just think this explanation might make a little bit more sense if you're focusing purely on the economic models. So that's going to be a correct solution, though. Next question says, a goal of financial regulatory agencies is to 1. Enforce workplace safety, 2. Protect the environment, 3. Enforce food safety, and 4. Prevent monopolies. Again, I think even with no economics background, you'd be able to say that if you're a financial regulatory agency, you're dealing with financial institutions, your goal is going to be most likely to prevent monopolies, right? And that's very true. You have organizations like the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulate banks and regulate different industries to ensure that they do not take too much market share of in those industries to create monopolies. And so there's a lot of examples of that happening. Let's take a look at the previous tutor's answer. And they also took prevents monopolies, and they said that financial regulatory agencies oversee and regulate the financial markets of an economy. Their fundamental goal is to maintain the efficiency of markets by preventing the creation of monopolies with unjust market powers. Financial regulatory agencies ensure that economic entities and financial markets do not exploit their power to become a monopoly. One of the biggest and most important financial regulatory agencies is the Federal Reserve Board that looks after the Federal Reserves, responsible for overseeing the monetary policy of the economy. Yeah, so good answer. And we'll mark that as correct, and we can move on to the next question. Okay, big question. So the next question says, a company is considering building a bridge across a river. The bridge would cost $2 million to build and nothing to maintain. The following table shows the company's anticipated demand over the lifetime of the bridge. The table for problem number 4 presents the number of crossings for different prices per crossing at prices of $8. The number of crossings is 0 at 7, 100,000 at 6, 200,000 at 5, 300,000 at 4, 400,000 at 3, 500,000 at 2, 600,000 at 1, 700,000, and at 0, 800,000. If the company were to build the bridge, what would be its profit maximizing price? Would that be the efficient level of output? Why or why not? If the company is interested in maximizing profit, should it build the bridge? What would it be its profit or loss? If the government were to build a bridge, what price should it charge? Should the government build the bridge? Okay, so Okay, so I think hopefully okay, so the previous tutor put together the table, which is good. And we just want to make sure they typed in all the numbers right. So we have 8 and 0, yep, 7 and 100, 6 and 200, 5 and, is it just linear? Yeah, 5 and 300, yeah, okay, 5, 300, 4, 400, 3, 500, 2, 600, 1, 700. Okay, sure. So we have total revenue and total cost and profit. Great, good columns. Total revenue is just going to be price multiplied by the number of crossers, and so we'll see if they did that calculation correctly. I think he typed one. So 700,000. Okay, I see. So the commas are a little off-putting, right? Because they're every 2 instead of every 3. 700,000, 1,200,000, or 1.2 million, 1.5 million. 1.6 million, 1.5 million, 1.2 million, 700,000, 0. Okay, and total cost is, it's not 20 million, it's 2 million, but that's just looks different because of the commas. So 2 million on each, and then you subtract total revenue minus total cost in order to get the overall profit. So negative 2 million, negative 1.3 million, negative 0.8 million, negative 0.5 million, negative 0.4 million, negative 0.5, 0.8, 13, and 20. Yeah, all looks good to me. So let's take a look at the questions that are asked. If the company were to build a bridge, what would be its profit maximizing price, right? So we want to see what is the highest profit possible. So unfortunately for this company, all the profit is negative, but the lowest, the smallest negative loss they would incur would be at $400,000, which would be at a price of $4 with 400,000 crossers. And so its profit maximizing price is $4. Would that be the efficient level of output? Why or why not? It would be the efficient level of output if the company decided that they wanted to build a bridge. Given these numbers, the most efficient level for the company were for to simply not build a bridge, because the company would rather make 0 than negative 400,000, right? The company's interested in maximizing profit. Should they build a bridge? No, it should simply, not move on to another project where they would make positive money. If the government were to build a bridge, what price should it charge? Should the government build a bridge? Explain. And so the government, if the government were to build a bridge, assuming the costs are still total costs, it would still be a $4 price for the government to be profit maximizing. If we were to assume that the government did not want to be profit maximizing, then maybe they would charge no money and allow as many people to cross as much, but it really depends on the preferences of the government. And should the government build a bridge? And again, it depends on whether or not this is like a public good that the government believes the total benefits would outweigh the total costs, not in terms of revenue, but in terms of benefit to the country or benefit to the surrounding community. If the government believes that the total benefit to the surrounding community is greater than the total cost of $2 million, then they should build a bridge. And so it just depends on other factors that we don't know. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor has said. The previous tutor said that if the company were to build a bridge, profit maximizing price is $4 where there's a loss of 400,000. This is an efficient output level that shows that there's less loss at this stage. If we increase our output, losses incurred by the company have increased at an increasing stage. In the scanning, the efficient output level has been reduced in a fast stage. So at least 400 level of output is an efficient level. Losses it's not 4 million. The loss is 400,000. I just want to clarify that. My point of view, no. The government considers profit maximizing as main goal when they don't construct a bridge, because from the bridge they never gain a profit. They've suffered a loss of at least 400,000, not 4 million. If they want the welfare of society, they'll give the travelers facilitates, then they'll build a bridge. If the government wants to maximize profits, they'll never build a bridge. But if they want to work for public welfare, they will build a bridge. So yeah, that's kind of what I said. It depends on preferences of the government. So I want to clarify a couple things. First, the loss at the profit maximizing level is 400,000, not 4 million. Second, the company would profit maximize differently if it has the option not to build the bridge, given that all price levels result in negative profits. The company would likely decide not to build the bridge and have zero profits. Finally, and actually I think everything else is fine. Finally, yeah, the government's decision to build the bridge depends on its goals under profit maximization. They face the same incentive as the private firm, but from a welfare standpoint, they could decide to build the bridge if total societal benefit is greater than the total costs. Okay, and so the solution is still correct, but we just clarified a little bit of the answer. Next, we have the following question. To fully understand how taxes affect economic well-being, we must compare the 1. Consumer surplus to producer surplus. 2. Price paid by buyers to price received by sellers. 3. Consumer surplus to the deadweight loss. And 4. Reduced welfare of buyers and sellers to the revenue raised by the government. And so when we look at taxes, right, we can draw a really simple tax impact. So on a supply and demand graph, let's say there's a tax imposed on the consumer. What that essentially means is that the price of the consumer goes up. The price the consumer pays. The price consumer pays would be right here, and the price that the business gets would be right here, and this would be the tax level, right? The difference between the two taxes, the two prices, right? And so we can see here that output shrinks. And we have deadweight loss right here, right? So this is what a traditional tax might look like, and we see something similar if you get a supply side tax instead of demand side tax. But what must we understand for to fully understand the effect of a tax, right? One says consumer surplus compared to producer surplus, and so here we have like consumer surplus up here, producer surplus over here, but it misses this middle section of government revenue. And so we wouldn't fully understand the impact of a tax because government revenue is revenue that we assume will be spent on other goods that are good for society, so we don't consider that a loss, even though it's neither received by consumers or producers. Second says a price paid by buyers to the price received by sellers. And so this is something that is important. We say that the price received by buyers is up here and the price received by sellers is down here. But again, we're missing the total tax amount, and so that's something that's important to understand the impact of the tax, so it's not going to be fully encompassing. 3 says consumer surplus compared to deadweight loss, so we would have this comparison right here to this one over here, but we're missing both the producer surplus and the government revenue, so that's not going to be a good answer. And finally, we have the reduced welfare of buyers and sellers compared to revenue raised by the government, and that's the biggest issue, right? Because this consumer surplus and this producer surplus remains despite the change in prices. The only thing that really changes is that there's deadweight loss here, and also that there's a certain amount of tax revenue going to government. So that's what we care about, the comparison between these two. And so 4 is going to be the best answer here. So let's take a look at the previous answer. And the previous tutor said 4 as well, and they said the imposition of a tax increases the cost of production for sellers and leads to a reduction in supply, shift the supply curve to the left. Sellers transfer incidence of the tax onto the buyers, the proportion of which depends on the elasticity of demand and supply. The difference between the price paid by buyers and the price paid by sellers is the amount of the tax that the government receives. The increase in price that buyers pay leads to a reduction in the consumer surplus. Simultaneously, the reduction in price that sellers receive causes a reduction in the producer surplus as well. Collectively, both reductions create inefficiency in the market. A proportion of the aggregate reduction is converted into tax revenue that the government earns. The portion of neither goes to the government nor is received by buyers or sellers is known as the deadweight loss. This deadweight loss represents the reduction in economic well-being. Hence, to determine the deadweight loss, we must compare the welfare of buyers and sellers to revenue raised by the government. Right? And so, great answer. Note that tax can also be imposed on the consumer side as well. But otherwise, great answer, and we mark that as correct. Okay, let's take a look at the next question. The next question says that businesses can use globalization to their advantage by 1, creating trade barriers to other countries, 2, reducing exports to other countries, 3, finding customers in other countries, and 4, insourcing jobs in other countries. And so we think of trade barriers and exports as mostly things that countries do. Businesses don't really control those types of things, although I guess you could say exports maybe, but the real power of globalization is that it opens up markets to each other, right? Goods and services that are created in one country can be sold to customers in an entirely different country. And so that's the big advantage of globalization, right? You can think of this as like even just trade between the United States and Mexico, where it used certain foods like avocados are very seasonal, and you didn't used to be able to eat avocados in the winter in the United States, but opening up of trade barriers and like free trade agreements and globalization allows that trade to continue so that farmers in Mexico can sell avocados to consumers in America and continue to make money even in the winter when they would otherwise not see as much demand. And so that's a really big benefit to businesses specifically. So answer choice 3 is going to be the best answer here, that businesses can use globalization to their advantage by finding customers in other countries. So let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. So the previous tutor said 3 as well, and they said that globalization is the process of integrating businesses, economies, economic sectors, and individuals around the globe, such that different economic entities can come together to function as a single unit of an internationally bounded, unregulated market. It has many inherent advantages to both producers and consumers. Excuse me. One way in which globalization can be advantage to businesses is that it can grant them with new markets to penetrate, and with new markets come new customers to serve. Businesses can expand their operations in different economies and foreign markets to find customers in regions other than their home that will not only increase their profitability, but also their longevity in the market, provided they sell above the risks attached. Yeah, so this is a good answer. You can say good answer. Mark that as correct. Okay. Next question says, when actual GDP is below potential GDP, the budget deficit increases because of what? And so budget deficit, again, is the difference between the total tax revenue that the government collects versus the total expenditure that the government makes. And so if you make more expenditures than you collected in tax revenue, you're going to have a deficit. And so when the actual GDP is below potential GDP, we call it a recession, a recessionary gap. And 2 things happen there that are going to affect the budget deficit. First is going to be transfer payments, which are basically payments to those who are going to be suffering from the bad economy. So unemployment benefits, more people on welfare or food stamps, a greater strain on the overall transfer payment system. These are all things that increase the amount that governments must spend and basically transfer it into the hands of people in the country because of the bad economy. And so that's going to directly increase the total expenditure of the government. So that's one way your budget deficit might increase. Any other way that the budget deficit might increase is affecting the taxes. And when there's a recessionary gap, you have high unemployment, you have people making less money, and so the income tax that people pay, which is the primary tax revenue source, is going to be lower. People don't have as much money, so they're going to be in lower tax brackets, and so the tax revenue that the government collects is lower. So in two different ways, we see that the budget deficit is increasing. The amount of money that the government must spend is going to go up, and the amount of money that the government collects is going to go down. So we have these two effects of a recessionary gap that both drive deficit up. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. So the previous tutor says that when the GDP is below potential, it is considered in recession. In the recessionary period, falling unemployment and output, people are laid off and industries are shut down. In order to maintain stability and maintain economic output, the government must implement several social and economic programs. Generally, it increases expenditure and reduces taxes, which is called expansionary policy. When government adopts this policy, the budget deficit widens during the period. In short, during recession, it is an increase in welfare and economic programs that widens the budget deficit. So this could be a better answer, I think. So more specifically, the budget deficit increases due to transfer payments, due to increased transfer payments and lower tax revenue. During a recession, more people qualify for transfer payments like unemployment benefits and welfare programs. As a result, overall government expenditure increases. On the other hand, recessionary gap implies higher unemployment. People will make less income, which translates into lower income tax revenue for the government. This twofold effect drives up the budget deficit. Okay, I can mark the solution as correct because they got the right answer, but a little bit better clarified here. Next question says, a monopolist will maximize output by producing at the level of output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost, or the last unit of output produced adds the same amount of total revenue as to total costs. The firm's total revenue exceeds total costs by the largest amount, or all the following are correct. So let's take a look at what the Monopolist graph looks like to explain the answer to this question. So we have our monopoly. Come on, let's try one more time. Regular supply and demand graph with our monopoly set up. So we have our demand, we have our marginal revenue, and then we have our supply. And so where do we produce here? And so and we assume that supply is equal to marginal cost. So profit maximizing rule is that even for monopolists is that you produce for marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and that's right here. And the difference is that because you have two different curves, marginal revenue curve and the demand curve, that the price that you charge is going to be the price on the demand curve, even though your output is decided by the marginal revenue equals marginal cost point. So your price is going to be here, quantity is going to be here, and this point was decided by where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But looking at the other answer choice, so marginal revenue equals marginal cost is true, but if you look at answer choice B, the last unit of output produced adds the same amount to total revenue as total cost. Adding the same amount to total revenue as the total cost means that marginal revenue and marginal cost are the same, right? At no other level, is that going to be true? And so if you're adding the same amount of total revenue, you have a marginal revenue. And as you do the total cost, you have marginal cost. This is the same answer choice as answer choice A. And finally, answer choice C says the firm's total revenue exceeds total cost by the largest amount. And when we say that we are maximizing profit, we know that profit is given by total revenue minus total cost. So when we maximize profit, it is given that the profit maximizing point must be the point in which the total revenue minus the total cost exceeds the total cost by the largest amount. So all three of these answer choices are correct. And that's why answer choice D is going to be the right answer here. Let's take a look at the answer choice given by the previous tutor. So the previous tutor said, a monopolist will maximize profit by producing the level of output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. In the event where marginal revenue exceeds marginal cost, production of an additional unit of output will inflate profits. At the point when marginal revenue equals marginal cost, profit is maximized because if the monopolist tries to increase output in excess of the equilibrium of MR equals MC, then this would result into marginal costs higher for each additional unit of output produced in the marginal revenue. This in turn puts a downward pressure on total revenues and profits. So this is actually going to be incorrect. We're going to say the correct answer is D. The profit maximizing rule is marginal revenue equals marginal cost. However, answer choice B is simply another way of restating this rule, and answer choice C is the definition of profit maximization, because profit is given by total revenue minus total cost. Therefore, all of the above answer choices are actually correct. So we're going to mark this as incorrect because they didn't get answer choice D as the right answer. Okay, let's take this look at this question here. So this question says, suppose that the demand and supply schedules for rental apartments in the city of Gotham are as given in the table below. You have monthly rent on the left side, and you have apartments demanded and apartments supplied. Okay, what is the market equilibrium rental price per month and the market equilibrium number of apartments demanded and supplied? So we know that at equilibrium, right, let's draw this out. At equilibrium in any type of market, you're going to have quantity supplied equal to quantity demanded. Whoops. Right, this is quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. And so we're looking for where these two numbers would be the same. So 10,000, 1,500, 1250, 500, 12,500, right? So this is going to be the only point we can check to be sure where the overall demand and supply is going to be the same. And so the equilibrium number of apartments demanded and supply is 12,500, and then the market price is going to be determined by that intersection, so it'll be $2,000. The next question says, if the local government can enforce a rent control law that sets the maximum monthly rent at $1,500, will there be a surplus or a shortage? So we know that the equilibrium is at $2,000, and then you set price ceiling at $1,500, which is below $2,000, you're going to result in a shortage. There's going to be too much demand and too little for too little supply, right? We can see that here. There's 15,000 units demanded and 10,000 units supplied. There's a 5,000 unit surplus, shortage. And so the next question says, of how many units? 5,000. And how many units will actually be rented each month? And it'll be probably 10,000, right? Because assuming no black market, that all 10,000 that are supplied are going to be sold because the price is so low. And so you have those answers for question B. And finally, question C says, suppose that a new government is elected that wants to keep out the poor. It declares the minimum rent that can be charged is $2,500 per month. If the government can enforce that price floor, will there be a surplus or a shortage of how many units, and of how many units will actually be rented each month? So this is the opposite. Instead of a price floor, we have a price ceiling. Instead of a price ceiling, we have a price floor. $2,500. We're going to have a surplus, right? It's too expensive. We're going to have too little demand for too much supply. 10,000 apartment units demanded, 15,000 apartment units supplied. There's going to be a 5,000 unit gap of apartments that go unsold. And so
how many units will actually be rented each month? It'll be 10,000. We can assume because there's so many apartments being supplied, anybody who's willing to buy one is going to be able to find one, and so there'll be 10,000 units supplied. Okay, so that's the answer to each question. Let's take a look at what the previous tutor said. Previous tutor said for A that the equilibrium is 2,000 and the equilibrium number is 12,500, and that the equilibrium number of apartments supplied is also 12,500, because at equilibrium, quantity demand is equal to quantity supply. Great. Next, it says that if the local government can enforce a rent control law that sets the maximum monthly rent at $1,500, then there will be a shortage. And this is true. We know that the shortage will be 5 units, and that the quantity supplied will be the quantity rented, which is 10,000. And finally, suppose you have this price floor at 2,500. We know there will be a surplus of 5,000 extra units that are not sold, and that the quantity sold will be 10,000. And so this is great. Great answer, and we can mark that as correct. It looks like that's all we have for today. A little bit short today, just because of the questions we're looking at. So hopefully this was helpful, and other than that, I'll see you guys next week.